spoiler warning for the Project Moon games, but if you don't care, I guess you can keep watching, lol.
You can tell a lot about a character in the Project Moon franchise based off of their ego and their identities. And since the ego is a reflection of the mind of someone, it can hold a rabbit hole of symbolism that connects to the backstory of a sinner. And not only that, but you'll be able to find connections with other sinners and the abnormality it is based off of. It gives ground for theories too. A certain symbolism that can appear will only be giving meaning later. You can find something interesting about a sinner through an ego, but will only know the true meaning of it once their canto comes out, or if more information gets revealed down the line. For Gregor in this case, this will be an interesting look. Since his canto was the first one, you'd expect we know most of what there is to know about him, but there's actually still a lot of mysteries about him. Like, do you know why Gregor's base ego features the library floor icons? Yeah, nobody does. But I'll be taking on the challenge. So if it wasn't clear, I'll be analyzing all the egos of the sinners from Limbus Company, highlighting one sinner at a time in each episode. This is the second episode, where I'll be taking a look at the outcast, war veteran, Gregor Samsa. Before we start, I want to give a huge thanks to the support of the first episode. Everyone else's own theories and observations were very cool to look at. Even though I couldn't respond to them all, I did read them all, and I can't believe I missed some very important hints and connections. So, once I release an updated version of Dawn's egos, I'll make sure to include the best ones. Also, if you have your own theories about Gregor's ego or Gregor in general, feel free to put them in the comments below. Then I want to give a quick shout out to the wiki.gg page for help for information, and kind of names for voicing Gregor in this video. Credits in the description. Also, just a heads up, I'm not the best analyst, so feel free to correct my mistakes in the comments as well. And of course, if you'd like to see more videos like this on your homepage, or if you simply want to support me, then why not watch the video? And if you like it, subscribe. Thank you. Now let's get on with it. Normally you'd say base egos of the sinners are pretty straightforward. They reference their backstory, which you can fish information out of from their cantos, but Gregory is a different case. Almost like he's some sort of outcast. Now for this part, I'm going to be heavily theorizing on the nature of Gregor's arm, and be talking about his character in general. Another heads up, I lost the plot a little when writing this script. It's theory time! But let's get the obvious connections out of the way first. The name itself is the first piece of the voice line of the ego, it being suddenly one day my arm had changed. How very clever. Now the line itself is a reference to the source book Metamorphosis from Franz Kafka. Suddenly one day, book Gregor woke up to have found himself transformed into a bug. Luckily I have read this book and I very much recommend you do as well, since it's a very easy read and a short read as well. But it's still packed with good content. Anyways, I'll try to read the source materials of the sinners I'll be analyzing from now on, as to not make any false connections to their book counterpart. But I'm saying try here, as I refuse to read The Dream of the Red Chamber. And I'm still also trying to finish my Moby Dick book, since that book isn't a short read either. But Metamorphosis is a book where you really get to see why the writer, Kafka, got his own genre, Kafkaesque, which is a term expressing alienation, anxiety-inducing uneasiness, and helplessness, mainly from the 20th century, usually fueled by nonsensical authority. This Kafkaesque themed writing is clearly seen in his novel The Trial, where a man is convicted of a nameless crime, but also in Metamorphosis itself, as when Gregor first woke up, he seemed to not even notice or wanted to mention or explain what happened to him, as it was so absurd that he had turned into a bug in the first place, and even so, he was more worried about coming to work on time, really nailing down the helplessness from authority, as he was conditioned to not want to miss work in the first place. The authority is also represented with his family, as they keep Book Gregor in his room, throw him an apple every once in a while to keep him fed, and let him rummage around the room. In the meantime, the family is trying to discuss how to get rid of him, as he is a disgrace to the family now for being stuck in his room, and is not allowed to show himself towards guests either. All that before Gregor actually passes away, when he learns that his family wants to get rid of him, and the family has a happily ever after afterwards. Now personally, and a lot of people probably agree with me on this, but this book has heavy symbolism for depression and or burnout. Perhaps even disability. Gregor was so focused on his work before, being a provider for the family even, but suddenly one day, he had enough subconsciously. At the beginning of the book, we get to see how it starts with Gregor wanting to sleep in, something he usually doesn't do. A common side effect of depression is difficulty getting out of bed and or out of your room. Now all Bug Gregor does in a novel is essentially run around in his room, as that is what a bug likes to do apparently, or listen to his sister play the violin. It is also comfortable for someone with depression to be in their safe place, away from embarrassment, as for when you're in a heavy depression, you might not have the energy to clean your room and or yourself, so you wouldn't want anyone getting in, and when you haven't had the energy to clean yourself, someone functional in society that wouldn't be able to understand your situation might get grossed out or confused, so you stay inside as well. And even more so depressing, Gregor only dies after the guests see him and label him and his family as gross because of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this household, quote unquote. For if a family has a depressed individual in it, the family members might get shamed as well, as a how could they let it get this bad? And since lots of depressed individuals don't want to be a burden, and especially someone like Gregor, who already had been exploited for money by his family and felt like he had to perform well, being put on a pedestal at first, and something like this can get even harder psychologically. So I think the instant death after the hard interaction with the outsiders isn't a coincidence, as I think it symbolizes suicide. And you can tell Kafka was miserable himself too, as the book literally says the family gets a happier life after Gregor passes away. I have to say, yeah, yeah, the world would probably be better off without someone like me. Thanks, Kafka. Now, Gregory in Limbus of course also suffered from depression as the aftermath of the Smoke War, also being put on a pedestal at first, not only by his comrades as he was adored by those under him, but also as a war hero in general, and of course by his mother, as his surgery was the only successful one. All of that war glory only for his arm to act out on its own, which is interesting in of itself, as for example, the buck arm is probably symbolism for something quote-unquote disgusting, like war experience and negative emotions like depressions and burdens that come with it. Then something like war memories in the way of PTSD and depression can literally take over and take control over a person, like Gregor sometimes loses control over the arm and highly emotional and when reminded of his past, but also how Gregor in the books suddenly loses control and gets a depression-fueled burnout, unable to do tasks and eventually spiral. Also maybe a stretch, but being stuck in your room like Book Gregor is also connected to Limbus, as Gregor would spend hours in the room watching the swinging apples. But I feel like that connects more with the Kafkaesque themes for Gregor, as it was more so due to a nonsensical authority, Gregor's mother, Herman, that Gregor was stuck in the room in the first place. And it gets symbolized in loops, for the cutting down of apples happened in loops, almost like brainwashing, and the Golden Branch Ego in Canto 1 shows Gregor war memories as a loop as well. Now, you can make some meta references to society, and link that to the nonsensical and fast-paced rhythm and loops placed upon us, of course starting in the 19th and 20th century, kickstarted by the Industrial Revolution, and shown in Kafka's work. Heavily simplified, wake up, work for money that isn't even equivalent to the fruits of your labor, come back, spend that money, repeat. Who told us to do it? Why do we do it? However the case, it is hard to break out of it. Loops are important symbolism here. You can also link it to how wars, like the Wing Wars, are a certain loop as well. It always seems to repeat itself, no matter how many times we condemn it or try to remember past mistakes and genocides. Even now, even after the Smoke War and other wars, more Wing Wars in the city are rumored to happen again. And when we talk about organizing or fighting against the stream in our current world, more often than not, the conversation will land on the fact that it would be almost impossible. Even if we think their authority is one we couldn't understand, or be so economically driven that it's jopeless, we'll have to participate in it as we often have no choice. Just like even the idea of fighting against the head in a city seems impossible, as their eyes are everywhere and their power is, as far as we know, unmatched. But the fixers will continue to be a gear in the city, as much as a criminal would be a gear too, hence why I feel like a Jan ID for Gregor would fit. They both have ponytails, there's totally no other connection, guys. Oh my god, I haven't even touched the ego itself yet, but I'm trying to make the things clear here. So the first theme here is an authority that has a certain way of living that can be seen as uneasy or nonsensical, that has taken over a life and somehow is seen as acceptable. One could get stuck in the ways even, for after skill is sloth. Now sloth in Limbus is described as the state of being directionless, surrendering oneself to inertia and the will of others, which fits incredibly well here, and with Gregor in general. I don't think I need to explain how. The Pekatula, a being born purely from a sin, this one for sloth, gathers stone to attack, and slowly gathers more stones to form a mountain. What a stable form, what stalwart balance it has attained. Indeed, at the edge of change was evolution found for this entity, yet even evolution is no deliverance from its torpidity. Yiseng mentions about the sloth Pekatule, symbolizing how even in sloth you can have a certain evolution. You can grow, albeit in the same slothful way, and when you grow, or well more so evolve in your slothful ways, it can even be more harder to move on. It can be even harder to move you, as the abno turns from a ball, pretty movable, to a mountain, more stuck, perhaps in its ways. Even evolution doesn't change its ways. Gregor could or couldn't have had a successful operation, you know, but he has always been under the control of Herman. His mother always had authority over him. Even before his arm had changed, even when a successful war hero, and afterwards, Herman is still interfering with Gregor's life, and Gregor states in his canto that he never ran from his mother's authority, being stuck in his slothful acceptance of this higher uncomfortable authority. Arms in general come back many times in this ego, as Gregor's arm changed, Herman's authority is symbolized through arms and hands, with an odd choice of nail polish to be fair, and there are also shadows of hands in Gregor's ego art. Now, the shadows in the sinner's base ego usually represent something of the past haunting them, or being motivation for the sinner's being or actions. Now, I want to say that the hands symbolize the lost lives of the war, grabbing towards Gregor with broken fingers and arms, the broken arms and fingers maybe being symbolism for the hurt inflicted on others. Now, arms could simultaneously also reference Herman's control, grabbing and having Gregor in a hold in some sort of way. But then again, why are they so broken? And also, feeling guilty about lost lives in a war is more fitting with someone like Autis, where it's literally symbolized as bodies under barbed wires. Likely a form of control from Autis, as Autis was a war general for the Smoke War. A war with no background being alike with Gregor, both referencing the Smoke War. Autis before has also stated concerns for the victims she has made during the war. Gregor's canto and story focuses more so on the survivor's guilt of a war. That survivor's guilt is made more clear through Yuri, of course, during the canto. There are no bodies in Gregor's base ego art, but there is pure loneliness with multiple weapons on the floor. The bleak floor and walls of the room really solidifies the human experiment past of Gregor, but also makes it feel lonely. Multiple arms are reaching out, people are fighting outside, yet Gregor is inside, just smoking multiple cigarettes. Now of course on the right you see the words no more, which could reference the victims of the war not wanting any more, or no more loops of war, or of course Gregor wanting no more abuse from Herman, and no more wars as he eventually left it, which in return lowered the morale of the soldiers though. On the left, although covered, I could make out the word mercy. Now that makes sense too, we compare it to a war. But then I wondered, since there still is a lot to know about Gregor, is this a light did you know gods of death love apple situation? Is it mercy no more, or no more mercy? No more mercy for who? The city perhaps? I'll get to that in a second. Like I said early in the video, Gregor has the symbols of the library on his arm. This could mean a lot of things, so I'll throw in some theories. First theory comes from Reddit, from user Rustery. They state that Gregor's arm is being restrained by the library, and they implement a more popular theory that Limbus Company's ultimate goal is rebuilding the city. Limbus Company's themes are indeed about the hell of the city itself. Lobotomy was more about the facility and the horrors that can happen in their technology, and of course Ian's story. The library is more focused on forgiveness, but also the eccentric characters in the city that are essentially a product of their environment. And for Limbus, that direction seems to be more about the sinners themselves, but also how they play a role in the quote-unquote horrors of the city. Now don't throw pitchforks, but I haven't read this Distortion Detective in full yet, but I know that Diaz plays a role of wanting to overthrow the head as well, as she had a big budget and wanted to grow her own personal army. Now some people think that Diaz is Dante, or that Diaz has a close connection to Dante. In some ways or form, I think there's a very high chance that Diaz has a certain influence on Limbus Company's objective. That would explain the insane budget, and don't forget how they both have D as the first letter of their name. User Rustery mentions that the city then also would go through some sort of change, almost like a metamorphosis. They say that along the story we slowly unlock floor abilities similar to the library, which makes sense as Dante unlocks that as well. And how chains are similar to how chains are used by Limbus. Just like how sinners are probably weakened and bound by the contract of Limbus Company, and that contract is symbolized through chains as well. Not only that, but the prison outfit is not worn by Gregor, but around his arm, which could mean that his arm is indeed under the control of the company, not Gregor himself. So are Limbus Company and the library in cahoots? I mean, the group of Diaz, Ujat, can be found in the Library of Runa's general reception, so they have been there before and could have sought contact after the events of Library of Runa. Also, when we're playing Canto 1 for this video, this dialogue really intrigued me. You should at least finish unwrapping what I gave to you. That little arm isn't all there is to it. So that definitely means that there's more to Gregor's arm than we know, but what we do know is that it's probably something suppressed, as it holds a great power. Not like suppression is something that hasn't happened before in this company. But then again, Herman explicitly mentions that the arm isn't all there is to it. Can it evolve into more? And why did Herman call this form an investment as well? Is there a way it could link to the library's powers, just like Dante can connect to the light as well? Well, for that we're going to have to start learning Jewish culture, dear viewer. This part is gonna be even more confusing, but trust me, it'll all connect at the end. Also, forgive me Jewish viewers if I got anything wrong. I was raised an atheist, so concepts of religion might be a little bit harder for me to grasp. But user Mr. Lestrade on Reddit mentions that Gregor might have been an attempt to create the primordial man, Adam Cadmon. Now Adam Cadmon, according to Wikipedia, is the first of 4 worlds that came into being after the contraction of God's infinite light. Not the same as the physical Adam Harishon, but it's pure divine light without vessels, aka pure potential of the human psyche, the collective human essence. Now all of these of course link incredibly heavily to Library of Runa and Lobotomy Corporation, and the Kabbalah itself has a lot of connections to the Tree of Light. Also pure light without a vessel reminded me of Evangelion's human instrumentality as its pure human essence before humans were a thing. Also the symbol is featured there many times. According to Wikipedia, the name Adam contains the ultimate divine purpose for creation, mankind, as well as the embodiment of the Sephiroth, where Adam is both the man and the divine. We can connect this to Gregor in a way, as Gregor both is a man, but is mixed with this experiment, which is more than meets the eye and could have incredible lore significance. But basically, if it were the case that Herman would want to experiment with the power of light, then it would make sense that the library is connected to the arm, as their energy source was also light. Gregor was called Potential Man as well. He could be an incomplete product. Only the upper and middle layer floor symbols are on his arm as well, meaning Gregor is not yet the perfect primordial human she wanted to create. Next up, since I don't really 100% get this, I'll let someone else explain it, but user Zanes the Argent also says, one of the virtues of Kabbalah adds, after all, an extra sephira, da'at, a shaky point in the ascension/emanation process where one may either keep proceeding or trip into the ego pitfalls and fall into the inverted tree of life. The makings of the primordial man are there, but fallen under the spirals of vice instead of virtue. So there might be some sort of tipping point in a story connected to Gregor or the library where we either trip into ego pitfalls and fall into the inverted tree of life, or we could ascend. Gregor distortion, perhaps? Now, the inverted Tree of Life could be anything in the context of the city, maybe just a continuation of the cycles of the city, since the other options would be ascension, which maybe could be that the original dream of wanting to overthrow the head like Limbus/Diaz did. But symbolism of the upside down Tree of Life is the idea that true spiritual strength comes from an upward connection to a divine source, with its fruits, that being actions and manifestations, coming down to earth, like divine power dripping down through its roots. So that is a lot of information. Let me see how I can link it to Gregor. First of all, of course the mix between light and human, as Gregor's arm could be connected to the light and of course get unlocked more and more as we progress the story. As Dante also unlocks more parts of themselves, Gregor at some point might have that too, or just one big unlock moment in the story. Herman very obviously seems set on wanting to steal the powers of Limbus Company, not only because she works with N Corp now after the fall of G Corp, where N Corp and L Corp have a habit of stealing each other's technology, don't forget the corridor in the bus is directly from N Corp, so since they steal a lot from each other anyways, Herman wanted to grasp the power of that former L Corp branch, the light, a manifestation of the collective human mind, and she might have wanted to reach that through Gregor, as that would explain the library symbols on his arm, as his arm would be more than a device for war, but something that needs the power of the library specifically, a place that was powered by light to keep it under control. That upside down tree after the tipping point was also about connection to a divine source and how power dripples down with branches. Now, the old Lobotomy Corporation branches have been referred to as being spread around the city, almost like a tree branch, spreading their power as a wing, but also eventually to spread the light as far as possible for the Seed of Light project. Not only that, but branches of light like divine power from the upside down tree of life are an obvious connection to the branches of light in general. Now, G Corp and L Corp of course were enemies, and that is quite a common strategy for oppositions to learn the weapons and secrets of each other. Now, because of this, Herman might have wanted to figure out the origin of abnormalities, or just light technology in general, as it seems to power many things. The power of light in branches Limbus tries to collect is immensely powerful, as she basically manifests everything you want with it, even revive dead people. Herman must have known this as she was a high-ranking officer in the war, and must have tried to create it through Gregor. How exactly we just can't know yet, and now with the existence of Limbus Company and the branches, it must have piqued Herman's interest and N Corp's interest again. N Corp of course also wanted the technology of any corporation that starts with an L, and that alongside Herman experimental nature in quest for light. Dare I say, I still don't know who Judas is, but a Judas Gregor would make a lot of sense. Canto 1 is the only canto where Limbus Company doesn't retrieve the golden bow, but if Herman was really that focused on collecting light, wouldn't Gregor also know more about it? He never mentioned anything though. What he does mention is that he never once strayed from that woman's path, meaning that his loyalty for his mother goes very, very deep. Not only that, but N Corp has brainwashing food, being able to give someone experiences through a bottle. Gregor, or even Merceau, since we're bringing up N Corp anyways, could have been brainwashed in a way to remain loyal. Now, user alternative H67440 says that Herman's research for the original form of humanity, the light, was to make a weapon representing the virtues of each Sephiroth, like how each floor in Library of Runa has a different status effect. With that they mean that his arm is supposed to be able to shift between sin affinities and status archetypes once he grasps full power, which makes sense, and I mean the sin affinities so far make sense too. Gloom, as there is no use against fighting the stream that is the authority of his mother, Sloth as he was or still is stuck in his ways and following orders, but then also a lot of lust. The lust in the ego could also be represented as him sharing a bit of himself out there as a war hero. Also, since this is still supposed to be an ego analysis, but so far this has only been a theory, and I totally didn't stray from the plot, but also at the same time, if you're still watching, I'm sure you don't mind, I wanted to mention the skill effects too. On hit, Gregor inflicts 10 of a random status, chosen from Burn, Bleed, Tremor, Rupture, and Sinking. Now, if Gregor was meant to be a mix of man and all of mankind experiences, then it having a bunch of the main status effects would make a lot of sense. Some people have connected the status effects to each finger on the arm, but I don't think that makes a lot of sense personally. Like, oh, Burn is Burn, and the bug arm might be Rupture since G Corp inflicts that, but then you have Gloop, Rock, and Robot. Ah, of course, my favorite status effects. Now, I actually think this might be a reference to the Wars of the Wings instead, since I mean this whole rant I did essentially was of the Smoke War, Herman's role in it, and the remnants of it, and Gregor's ego has references to the Smoke War in general. Themes of a war are prevalent, as I mentioned, the looping being a theme too. Now, the bug finger could represent the Smoke War, and something like the robot finger could represent the war against robots in the city, but if that were the case, something like a blood finger would fit too for the war against blood fiends, and we don't have a connection to the other fingers either. Then again, if you want to go full-blown symbolism, it could be about the general experience of prosthetic users in general, more aligned with the suddenly one day I had changed, and how prosthetic users in the city usually don't treat themselves with respect often after getting their prosthetics, like how you can see with the multi-crack office fixers. Or, if we're still talking about light and the original human, you can connect the gloopy finger with K-Corp, as their singularity is about reverting to the original state, G-Corp for Herman then of course, and the other three would be other groups or wings that have something to do with the original human or light. Now, actually, originally, this ego was written in Hebrew. Makes sense because Franz Kafka, the author of Metamorphosis, was also Jewish. But of course, you can make a connection to Gregor's relation to the Kabbalah and how that is connected to the Sephiroth and the library. Furthermore, art-wise he spots the G-Corp outfit, which makes sense, as we would be stuck in his war memories. Now, just a quick sub summary for everything since that was a lot. There are themes of war in this ego, of course, which in the ego itself can be seen in the background, but also could be represented in the shadow arms, but most of all, the themes of Herman play a big role here. I want to say almost more than the war itself, as even if the shadow arms were a representation of the victims of the war, Gregor's experience of the war was heavily influenced by Herman's control too. Even so, even after running away from the war, Gregor admits he has never not listened to his mother, and stays stuck in his obedience ways, as is represented by the sloth skill, of course. The sloth is also represented in the depressing Kafkaesque nature of Gregor, being a pawn in society in his book counterpart, and being a part of the war and his mother in Limbus. That along with the fact that there is a very high chance that Herman is seeking out the light's power, whether that be through Gregor himself or through collecting the branches. What she wants to do with it and what her ultimate goal is will remain unclear though. But for now, I'm willing to bet that this will lead to a tipping point in the story of Limbus where Gregor, Herman or Herman's group in general will play an important role here, either ascending or changing the city, or maybe even falling in a deeper despair. This ego disguises itself as something simple. At first glance you would think it would be only about Gregor's war experience and his arm, but when you take a deeper look, it clearly seems to hint at a larger narrative and foreshadow something we just can't exactly know yet. So it was incredibly hard for me to find connections, hence why this part is mostly theorizing. In the script I wrote that I was having fun with this video, but I'm not having fun anymore having to read all of this out. Now let's change the pace to a more ego analysis focused video, where I will look at the abnormalities and egos itself and try to link them to Gregor. Now let's start with AEDD. This ego is based off of the abnormality shock centipede. Gregor gets to make notes of this abnormality, meaning that he probably has an important connection to the abnormality in a way. The observation logs are usually short, so any observation, even if originally deemed irrelevant, has a meaning. Gregor notes that the abnormality has huge plates of armor and functions like a robot. Its eyes are red and glinted often, and even so much so that Roger mentions that they kept glaring at the sinners. Anyways, Gregor then mentions that the centipede doesn't hurt anyone with its electricity, but only with the blades of armor around its body. But it still needed to charge up, and when you break the head, electricity starts flowing through its entire body. The interesting part though is that after breaking the head, Gregor makes a comparison about centipedes, that their nerves stay active for a good while, even after their heart stops beating. Gregor suspects that it must have been following some sort of laws or routines, and that the strategy is to just wait for it to run out of power. It'll go down on its own. But most importantly, Faust mentions that nerves are activated by electric stimuli. Now keep that in mind for later. Faust goes on to say that no logic should apply to something like an abnormality. In moments like these, Dutch people say this is where the quarter dropped. Google what it means. I already noticed in the last video that Faust likes to say the classic biologist line where human sciences, like emotions, shouldn't apply to animals, like abnormalities. But that's weird, since these abnormalities are literally sourced from human minds, so human sciences and perhaps logic should be used when analyzing them. Faust should know this, so why interrupt? Well, she also did so with Telepol, right when the notes started beginning about how the wolves were controlled by a higher power. I already made a theory about how she might have been a child experiment, so she could have interrupted because she was uncomfortable and got reminded of her past. But here she interrupts again. Now I can explain why, dear viewer. This abnormality is a reference to shock experiments. Now, you can kinda already see that with the way the abnormality is behaving. To start, it has a big wall of armor put up, which could be a reference to how subjects of shock experiments, or victims of hurtful behavior therapy, or experiments in general, could put up an emotional wall to block out the pain or deal with it. Yet the creature still needs electricity to function. Now, electricity could be literal here, but you can also link it to the pain of experiments of Herman and control. He did essentially get motivated by Herman to take the actions he did at the start of the Smoke War. The electricity could also be symbolized for his arm in general. The centipede doesn't actually like using electricity to hurt, like how Gregor isn't fond of using his arm as well. Also, Gregor, like the centipede, might have put up a big struggle as a last resort and left the war, as Gregor didn't want to serve any company anymore, but it'll run out of power and go down on its own. Gregor still joined Limbus. Gregor still needed electricity, aka control, to function. It's not like Limbus has good employees benefits besides revival. They have huge control over the sinners. The centipede going down on its own part is probably more related to how victims of unethical experiments behave. Even with their walls put up, if they're trapped, their last efforts to be free eventually will have no success, and they will have to put up with eventually happens anyways. The fact that it relies on the electricity, and when you break its head, the electricity flows all throughout the body, could be related to how victims of power dynamics fall back and rely on what or who hurt them in the first place. You break its head, aka what was keeping it together, its literal mind, and it becomes one with the electricity, which could also be related to Gregor, as Gregor was almost mind-broken in that room when he was younger. As we don't really know if that apple that we see turning into a heart was purely symbolic, or he was actually just losing track of time and mind-broken and hallucinating. Either way, he accepts Herman's control afterwards, and the fact that the centipede follows a routine symbolizes actual experiment routines, or the routine/cycle of falling back into your abuser's hands. It could mean that Gregor still actually could accept Herman's control again, or already has. But the shock experiment symbolism doesn't stop there, as the mirror dungeon event has you interacting with the centipede in a way that could only be described as a FNAF 5 circus baby moment.
Let's encourage baby to cheer up with a controlled shock.
You can basically only torture the creature or yourself. When you stimulate the centipede, it seems to twist its body as if in some sort of dance. Not a dance of joy though. This is another reference to control, as Herman literally forced Gregor, of course, to perform as a war hero. A sick dance, certainly not out of joy. The ego gifts you get are called standard duty battery, with standard duty probably being a reference to the standard duty of shock experiments, the word standing being irony almost, just your average day facing the horrors. It inflicts more rupture if the skill is envy, and you get it when you choose the option of clicking the electricity option where it dispenses the battery. It's a standard duty for the centipede to be electrocuted and then produce something in return. Like how Gregor is Herman's little Bitcoin investment project, it was a standard procedure for him to be experimented on and in return give something valuable to Herman. You also get an uncapped defibrillator, which heals you more the lower your HP is. Not much to see there, but maybe some sort of sympathy for those who have it worse. Also, this abnormality was introduced for line 2, where it's labeled as exploitation. Yeah, kinda obvious with that one. Now, this abnormality is shared amongst Gregor, Heathcliff and Hohenheim. The distorted line of Heathcliff is, "It's my turn to torment you now," which hints at the wrath check part of the abnormality, where once it's out, you want to torture everyone around you instead. Yet I couldn't really connect it to Gregor. I mean, for Heathcliff it fits, where he always had a revenge mentality towards those who wronged him at the manor, as it is now his turn. Though Gregor's line for the ego is,
"Alright, try enduring this. I'll fry you just enough to kill!"
where he talks about enduring, which references the fact that he himself has already endured experiments. Yet I don't 100% get the fry you just enough to kill part. Since experiments usually don't involve killing your subjects, you kinda need them, and that'll break some ethical codes, I think. But it could be the to kill isn't Gregor himself as a test subject, but someone else, as Herman did break Gregor's mind at just 15 and younger. Who knows how long the experiments were going, as we only saw one instance at his 15th birthday, but frying enough to kill someone else, as it was highlighted with the apple turning into a heart. He was broken due to experiments at a young age to turn his arm into a weapon, to kill not just anyone, but to be a pawn of a whole wing war. Not only that, but the kill could also be metaphorically, as Gregor would probably be a completely different person if all of this experimenting hadn't happened to him in the first place. In a sense, Herman killed Gregor not only by absolutely sucking any personal wishes out of him, so much so that he mentioned he never lived his own life, but also killed any instance of original personality or willpower in his own life. I mean, he's a perfect reflection of a doomer guy due to Herman, and the distorted line of
"Are you the new test subject?"
literally puts the nail on the coffin. Which is probably also why Heathcliff has this ego, as themes of non-control, a disdain towards your captors, in this case the manor, changed Heathcliff too, you know? That disdain could also be seen through the way the abnormality constantly glares and has glistening eyes, watching those outside and those toying with it. Even more so, the abnormality reflects onto Heathcliff by covering most notably his eye, his mouth and his bat. His bat is of course symbolism for the revenge, it says it on his bat, his eye, on how that revenge blinds his vision, and his mouth, for how he speaks, or more so how he presents himself. For Gregor, it's of course his arm, the source of the experimentation in the first place. Not only that, the outfit of Heathcliff looks more hooligan-like, as Gregor's outfit is more professional, reflecting that the entrapment for both of them was different. For Heathcliff, it symbolizes how different and backstreet-like he must have looked compared to the rest of the manor, his revenge, which is something that dictates how he acts, and something that he carries with him, symbolized by the bat. For Gregor, it's in his arm, something that is him, and the professional researcher's outfit reflects that actual neat environment of an experimentation, a visual cover-up almost for the horrors taking place. When distorted, Gregor's other arm also turns into a centipede, yet his right arm charges up. Makes sense, as again that arm was the source for the pain, the electricity. Also, his eye gets covered up only when distorted. Makes sense, with how Herman's vision was ultimately Gregor's vision. But most interestingly, the face/nameplate on whatever you call it is crossed out in the corroded version. This also happens with Heathcliff. Now this could symbolize the change Heathcliff and Gregor made in relation to their entrapment. While at first accepting the insults or experiments, maybe not even seeing the bad nature of it, eventually when out, they grew a hatred towards the experimentation or entrapment as a whole. Now the sin affinities are envy and gloom. Now I don't think I need to explain envy again in relation to this ego, but gloom is probably represented as the futility of struggling, which is literally reflected in Gregor's canto, as he never won straight from his mother's path. There's no use to struggle, and one could get pulled back in the waters easily, as the centipede needs electricity to function. Now, lastly, I wanted to connect it with Hohenheim as well. I'm not gonna go too deep into Hohenheim, since the themes of the Abno are obvious in relation to his past work. As I was reading through the wiki page, though, I got reminded that he was pretty arrogant, yet uses that mentality to cover up his history and his emotions. That reminded me again of that wall of armor from the centipede. Heathcliff also definitely has a wall of personality, and has shown multiple times to not want to let his guard down, and gets embarrassed when talking about emotions. Gregor usually makes jokes about his bog arm as well as a way to cope, but also the fact that there's probably more to Gregor than we could know, could also relate to the armor. But Hohenheim really has more connections to Heathcliff in the first place, hence why Heath had to make the lock for his distorted form and was his right-hand man in the intervallo. The glowering part of the abnormality is more focused on Heathcliff's background, probably referencing the revenge, and the shocking part is more a part of Gregor. So there's themes of imprisonments, experiments, putting up emotional walls, not wanting to utilize what you've been given as a result of the entrapment, needing control to function, the cycle of returning to the abuse, and maybe even accepting it as a part of your identity. Let's move on to Bygone Days. Now, I feel like this one might actually be one of my favorites. Unexpected, since the others look cooler, but it literally carries an important meaning. I'll start with the observations from Gregor again, since it'll explain everything. Gregor mentions that it's wearing a snazzy suit to cover up a hideous lower half. The abnormality believes it's a butler of a manor, and it's carrying around a portrait of its master. Now, this ego is different for anybody that has it. Gregor has insectile appendages, Yi-Sung carries a piece of broken glass, and Ishmael has a golden pendant. It's a reference to the fusion ego gift or reminiscence. So, right after noting the most important details, Gregor immediately gets reminded of the war days, where he recalls he had to carry pictures of the portraits of the dead while marching down the street. It was done to honor the dead, but Gregor thinks it was sick and that it was a way of taking advantage of their deaths. Furthermore, Gregor knows that when you take down all of the portraits the Abno put up, it becomes furious for revenge, as it hurts the person who got the last hit on the real portrait. Gregor mentions that the focus on that one person eventually spread to the other sinners, saying that letting rage out didn't help it keep a cool head. Even more so, Gregor adds that he doesn't get the revenge at all, and that throwing your life away is stupid. Living things get to keep on living, and revenge isn't worth anything if it gets you killed. Yi-Sang adds on beautifully, "Flower once bloomed with such resplendent a radiance has wilted for naught, reflecting the dangers of changing your mindset for revenge and war." Now, this all in all is just a good way to describe the culture around soldiers. It has been a thing that a recruiter's perfect audience is a young man. These young men can and probably will be manipulated in a way to convince them to join the war and participate in nationalistic culture. It is done so through symbols and changing of norms and values to be more fit for a quote-unquote war. There's a certain culture of he fought well when a soldier dies in that war, as if to praise the acts of a war. It is almost like a loophole. Personally, I find war barbaric, a thing of the past that has stuck with human culture, yet when dressed in symbols like putting a flag over a coffin, marching down with portraits of the deceased and planning revenge, acts of killing and conquest get painted in a different light. Even though these soldiers are victims and gears of a greater structure of violence themselves, this structure will continue to stand upright if the gears of it are treated this way. Even though a soldier might have wanted the army money to go to college, even if he put his life in danger, quote unquote, for others, he still participated in the structure. He was still a pawn. The coffin with a flag over it deems the life of that young man purely as if his purpose was for that flag. It is not just a piece of cloth, it's a symbol. His life gets a stamp on it as if he lived purely to die for that flag. Like it wasn't someone who had different ambitions in life besides that war. The flag also symbolizes how other soldiers must march down with the portrait of the fallen soldier. They must put the flag over their coffin. They are encouraged to get revenge, and most importantly, the culture of not being able to speak out about it. This system stands because of the norms and values that you shouldn't question a soldier or a general. The soldier is doing what is right for the country, isn't he? The soldier has seen things you wouldn't wish to see, which is why you should respect him. You shouldn't question a general and why they're making that soldier march with portraits of his dead friends to continue the cycle of violence for their own gain. You shouldn't question a soldier on how he might have killed innocents for college money, and you should most importantly not question the norms and values of our current society that makes a soldier quote-unquote respectable. For as long as the victims, either soldiers or civilians, dead or alive, of pointless wars is something to look up to and respect, and something that shouldn't be questioned, something holy almost, wars will continue to happen. Gregor doesn't want to march down with the portraits. He sees it as another encouragement to violence. He hates the mentality of they got our body so we must get one of theirs. It's pointless, especially as a pawn for a country's economic gain, or in this case a wing. This gets represented in the fact that the abnormality is a maid. The butler puts his master on a pedestal, like a general would be as well. It is also interesting how the abnormality hides an ugly lower half. This could reference how symbols like a flag can dress up or change the meaning of something like a coffin. The abnormality talks about the horrible things that have happened at the manor, yet still praises the master, calling him noble. When you tell the abnormality you cannot see the face of the master of the portrait and fail the check, it says, "Look not at the time that is spent and focus on the painting, the face of my master who has gone through so much." Again putting him on a pedestal and saying that because the master has gone through a lot, you should look at the portrait and remember him. Now the portrait is dusty, which could symbolize something like the flag covering a coffin, as soldiers are remembered usually by how they were at their time at war, not who they were outside of that. But when you clean the dust off, the abnormality is flustered and appreciated it, and even says that the master himself will be happy, probably because the master will be properly remembered now. When you fail the check, you'll act too rash in your approach, and the abnormality calls us rude, again being a reference to how talking about how a war is exploitative to someone who praises it can get you called disrespectful. You are disrespectful for trying to erase the war part of him, cleaning the dust, and call him a victim. So when the abnormality tells you to look at the portrait of his master to remember him, he really is asking you to remember his duties, not the actual master. Yet the abnormality itself doesn't seem to realize that, as it gets flustered when you successfully remove the dust. Now, you might ask, how does this connect to Yi-Sung and Ishmael then? Well, for them it's more so about nostalgia around certain people in general. Remember how they all have different objects? Yi-Sung put the League of Nine on a pedestal at first and certainly dwelled in the past about them. Even more so, one of the Abno gifts is called Recollection of a Certain Day, which can reference the day the League of the Nine disbanded for Yi-Sung, and for Ishmael when her crew fought the Phalid Whale. For Ishmael, it's connected to the abnormality of course with nostalgia, but also with revenge and remembering dead people. She of course was so blindly obsessed with acting out on revenge for her dead crew towards the whale. Also remember how the ego of Ishmael has the gift Reminiscence? That ego gift gives you more poise if you use gloom attacks, meaning the sadder you are about your long lost dead acquaintance, the faster you are. Now let's look at the ego itself. The voice lines are pretty straightforward.
Allow me to introduce you to this manner.
Showing that this Abno takes over Gregor quite well, as it's not all too personal and more so as if the Abno itself is speaking. The only thing I could connect with Gregor is that Gregor was a war hero, meaning he acted out as war propaganda. In a sense, he was a sort of introduction to the acts of war for new soldiers. The posters could have been a reason why a soldier wanted to recruit themselves, you know? The distorted lines, however, are
Butlers, where are the stewards of this house? You must know. Lead them to me. No!
Again, it's more like the Abno is speaking, but Gregor takes on an authoritative role, as he is commanding other butlers, which makes sense considering his position in the war. In the past, if you gain another ego resource, if the target is defeated after the unit's attack, probably because the revenge is completed. The affinities are lust and gloom. Gloom would fit in the futility of struggling against something like the orders of a war, as Gregor hated marching with the portraits, but he did it anyways, as it is about revenge and of course then about human bonds. The soldiers are close enough with each other to want revenge, and of course spreading that revenge is spreading more violence. Art-wise, there's not much for Gregor's normal version, just a dashing outfit. But when corroded, you can see that the lower half Gregor tries to cover up as himself. Now, I wrote a whole part about how Gregor wants to hide himself in his arm, but then I looked at the other versions and noticed they all have put themselves on the lower half. I am a master in over-analyzing. But they are different though. Ishmael has the pendant of nostalgia, if a crewmate were in there I'd bet it's Quixote, and the arms reminded me of mermaids. For Yi-Sung it's a broken mirror, referencing Mirror Tech and the League of the Nine, and for Gregor it's purely bugs. Although he is the only one to actually hold a portrait like the Abno. For Gregor, a portrait like that would of course symbolize the portraits of his fallen soldiers, and the arms are bug-like of course referencing G-Corp's experiments. The voice lines also reflect the mirror revenge, as the abnormality curses you out for not being able to clean the portrait, it calls you a bad guest, and the distorted Yi-Sung calls you an interloper and commands you to leave the place. This could be because Yi-Sung, Gregor and Ishmael were all parts of groups in a way. The Abno calls you an interloper often in the fight as well, probably being a play on how groups often have an us versus them mentality, that being especially efficient in a war. I only realize now, but the culture of war for the others can be the culture of groups in general, and for the abnormality the culture around butlers. The culture in their group, which usually didn't like outsiders, dictated how they lived during and after. In fact, that is reflected by the voice lines. Like I said, Gregor is somewhat authoritative like a war commander, Yi-Sung is inviting at first but then calls you an interloper, because there was a betrayer in his group, and Ishmael says, by the commander of my master, reflecting the command of Ahab. Lastly, the backgrounds of the ego seem to show a sort of progression. At first the Abno arrives, then it opens its mouth, and shit flies everywhere, only then it seems to move, or show a different angle. This could show how close the sinners are with their past group. I mean, Gregor actually left the group, Yi-Sung was forced out almost, but Ishmael still kinda lives by the rules. But that's about all I could find. Well, it's time for Limbus' strongest ego! The Christmas ones! Let me take a look at everything. Look at the little Gregor and Ishmael plushies. Or at least I think that's what they are. Why else make a ginger sheep? Anyways, I feel like this ego doesn't have many secrets. Sounds good, but it only makes it harder for me to find connections. To start, the abnormality connected with the ego is Cozy Bed, which doesn't really need literary references or anything, as it is simply based off of the childhood fear of monsters being in your room, for example under your bed. Now, I see this come across in egos more often, but both Ishmael and Gregor utilize the ego gifts you can get from the Abno. Ishmael is holding the snuffed lantern, and Gregor is using the snuffed candlestick. But there's not much of a difference between the two gifts, as they both utilize low morale. Not only that, but Gregor's and Ishmael's projections of Cozy Bed are different too. Ishmael looks very luxurious in a way, and Gregor's is almost shaped like a hospital bed, the frame being made out of metal, which I think has a reason. See, the mirror event puts emphasis on if there is or isn't something under the bed, with flickering lights warning us not to approach. It's supposed to represent a lingering fear and the need to hide. I can mostly connect it to Ishmael, as she was scared shitless when her own canto was approaching. She was afraid the sinners couldn't handle the task of sailing the Great Lake, let alone face the whale. You could almost say that the fear of the lake buffed her though, even as Indigo Elder complimented the way that she sharpened her harpoon. That fear of the lake is represented through tentacles with Ishmael, probably referencing the mermaids. Gregor is represented as multiple bug arms, maybe being a reference to how Gregor is supposed to manifest his arm in different ways. Not only that, but in the background you see one arm reaching out of the closet. Really nailing it down, huh, Limbus artist? The candles surrounding the bed, some out, some lit, could represent people of the past that could linger in the minds of Ishmael and Gregor, with the unlit candles maybe representing dead comrades. Furthermore, I think the bed could also represent the feeling of being stuck. I mean, it's a sloth skill after all. With Ishmael it being her stuck on revenge for the fallen whale, as she talks about how curiosity eats you whole, as her curiosity led her to see the whale, and for Gregor him being stuck in his self-hatred. His lines being,
"You saw a monster, huh? Did it look like this, by any chance?"
implying that he himself is worse than the monster. We really shouldn't forget just how low the self-esteem of this man is. His low self-esteem is so unchangeable that it gets his own sloth ego. Now when Quixote he says,
"Fear, horror, and anxiety. In the shadow beneath the orb lies a monster!"
See, I didn't want to say fear and horror would play a role for Gregor's vision of the ego either, but I think again here the fear and the horror is referencing the war, and the feelings Gregor must have felt then. Now the interesting thing is though, Gregor is talking about here is the war, then the shadow beneath what lies there is the monster, which makes sense, as a reflection of the war, as a shadow of the war, is Gregor suffering. You can actually call Gregor a fucked up reflection of not only G-Corp's modification, but also just the smoke war in general. It still messes with Gregor. Quote unquote, in the shadow beneath the bed, means that all that self-hatred Gregor has is something that overshadows where it stems from. Also, the abnormality can be seen as a sort of pest or invasive insect, just like how Gregor sees himself. Gregor might make bug guy jokes all he likes, and see himself as a non-human in a way, but it all stems from the huge trauma the guy has. Even the fucking plushie is traumatized. Just look at it, just look! It has its arm ripped off. Speaking of, why the plushies? Well, since it's sloth, it could reference a childlike way of thinking, as the ego is based off of the OG childhood fear already. When stuck in fear or self-hatred, one might call you selfish. I do find it funny though that Ishmael is holding out cookies in a hot chalky, almost as if to lure something, like the whale. Now skill and passive wise, it again relies on low morale, just like the ego gives, again making a reference to anxiety and the horrors. Now the ego background itself references that too, as you see shadow arms, god how many fucking arms do I have to see, to reference that lingering fear. Also for some reason there's a melting clock Dali style in the background. I mean you could connect it to the whole sloth idea on how being stuck in your race or constantly hiding from something you feel lingering might make you lose track of time, but that would be a stretch. Then again, I couldn't explain this random ass skull either if I wanted to. I could maybe explain the Christmas theming though. I mean, you could say it's just in relation to the Christmas event, but that'd be too easy. I think this lingering Christmas tree and maybe also the ribbon tree thingy, whatever that is, with presents, at least for Gregor, could represent the literal present he has. I mean, Herman says his arm is a gift after all, and the ribbons connecting to everything could be referencing Herman's control reaching far, but I have to stretch so hard for this ego to find connections that you hear some bones cracking. So I think I'm just gonna move on for the next one. Surely there won't be any more super obvious hints to his arm and how it could be so much more, right? Let's start with the obvious reference. A rope disheveled Jewish man with related to an abnormality on a cross references Bible scenes with themes of thorns. Isn't this basically Jesus Howard Christ? Well, yes, but also no. Let me say why. You know what cross Jesus was strung upon? Yes, that one. Now let's look at Garden of Thorns. Wait a second, that's a St. Andrew's cross. Now a St. Andrew's cross is where, guess who? St. Andrew was crucified, and he was the first disciple, the first man to follow Christ, which all in all makes sense. Christ in holy imagery is usually related to light and Carmen, or Antichrist. And Gregor, or well mostly his family, Herman, wants to get close to that light. So it kinda makes sense that the way to represent a samsa is to put him on the giant St. Andrew's cross instead. Not only that, but St. Andrew was the first disciple, and Gregor was the first sinner to get introduced. He was the first canto, again probably meaning he, his arm, or Herman will be very important in relation to the holy of the story, probably in reference to the light. Now, Garden of Roses itself is an abnormality that probably references the distortion phenomenon as well. It constantly wants to share something with us and asks us what we wish for. What made the connection easy is the quote, "You have to bloom the roses. You want to escape this garden, don't you?" As when Carmen is trying to make someone distort, she often mentions the city and how you should ignore its standards to release your own true wish. Not only that, but the abno is disappointed when you don't put your seeds to usage, and not allowing them to bloom isn't fair. Funnily enough, if you accept but fail, you get called bland, which honestly could represent the phenomenon of turning into Pekatule, as that basically only happens when you're boring. But honestly, the distortion phenomenon being in relation to this abno should have been obvious in the first place, as it has a lot of roses like Carmen, and those bloom out of sins. Heck, the flower has an intestinal texture, referencing to how lunacy isn't really a real flower, but a nervous system. Now, I've gotten some comments about this before, but there really is a possibility that if there be another Gregor account though, or story related to Gregor, then he might just distort. I do wonder what would happen to his arm if he did. Not only that, but the fact that when a sinner dies, they bloom instead could be another reference to distortion. However, when they do the death animation, they take a normal crucifixion pose, so I think Jesus and its first disciple are in close relation to this abnormality in ego both. But I think the blooming mostly could reference the different ways Gregor's arm could manifest as well. I mean, Gregor's voice line itself reflects that.
Can't say I've brought you a gift. Take this instead!
The gift of course referencing his arm, it's made obvious that the thing that blooms, roses, is on his arm. It also mentions his dissatisfaction with his arm, whether it's a gift or not. It's funny how he says it isn't of any worth though, as in the Mirror Dungeon event where you knock down a sign to fight, Dante says that they don't get what it's trying to share, but it's probably not of any worth as well. Meaning that basically the experimentation with light and Gregor's arm from Herman's perspective, or maybe even what Carmen is trying to share, isn't even of that much use. I mean, it might be powerful, yes, but is telling someone to go apeshit simply because they can really gonna help the city? Seems more like you want to start a chain reaction of distortions to me, which makes me think, just a little theory, but what if Carmen is just lonely and distortions help her connect? As she's basically one with light, she is primordial soup, so maybe the only way she can feel another person's presence, or maybe even merge with them, is to help them distort. Since in a combat event, the abnormality switches pronouns all the time. Let me help you, and stuff like be with us, be with me, which could explain her not so morally correct way of helping people in the city. Anyway, when corroded, the line is,
Hands off! Don't try to untangle those brambles. It's better this way.
Which referenced the Mirror Dungeon event, where you untangle its branches, its body falls apart. The thorny brambles you thought were a source of constricting pain, ironically had been keeping the body together. Because the game uses the word ironically, I must assume it's something painful that must keep Gregor together as well. This might be another AEDD thing though, where routine of experiments kept Gregor together back in the day, but actually probably also references the symbolism of thorns anyways. For Gregor, art-wise, the thorns appear on his arms and his head. Now when I first saw this, I almost jumped in excitement because like I said, his arm is something painful that somehow keeps him together, it is what made him special, and the war hero back then in the first place. It is what people used to put him on a pedestal and keep his position in the war, even when everything in relation to it hurt. But then there are also thorns on his head. He carries the burdens. He's literally wearing the crown of roses. Now this could be a reference to how he must remember the war and its victims, which could further explain the voice line of it's better this way, as Gregor doesn't want anyone else to carry his burdens. It's his cross to bear. Cue the laughing track. Gregor has a survivor's guilt mentality, and I mean, that is something that is on your mind a lot. What better way to represent that than through a crown of roses? But then again, isn't that another Jesus reference then? Didn't Jesus bear the sins of others too? Is this supposed to be Jesus or not game? I don't know. But I was also excited because the roses are also on his head, meaning that something might bloom from his mind. This may be being more foreshadowing for a potential Gregor distortion. Now, this might be a random observation, but the background reminded me of something. Aside from the fact that Honglu mentions in the observation logs that his family wouldn't like the flower arrangement of the abnormality, although Ryoshu think it's a work of art, the ruins of the building in combination with the barren wasteland and wooden planks could reference the remains of a war. In fact, it could reference no man's land. These were the results of trench warfare, where in between trenches lie muddy wastelands, bodies, wooden structures with barbed wires, and big holes from artillery and grenades. If you were standing there, you'd basically be cooked. But the background could also just be the remains of a war in general, with the ruined structures. But then again, the ruined structures are all white and remind me of old Greek and Roman buildings. But I can't find a connection with that. Honglu also mentions that the abnormality was trying to convey something along the lines of bondage and surveillance, with its thorns and eyes. Trust me, Honglu, I already came across bondage when searching for what kind of cross this was. I mean, Gregor was under the control of Herman, the bondage, and also under surveillance. Honestly, he still is, as N-Corp is following the sinners. They're still being observed. Since there aren't many connections beside those I mentioned between Gregor and the abnormality itself, I think the real connection really is between Herman's surveillance over Gregor and the ability to bloom his arm or his mind in the future. The blooming then also being in relation to light, as that is probably what Herman was going for, but also blooming meaning Gregor's either going to distort in the future or his arm will bloom in different ways in the future, or both. This is something that hurts, yet is something that is needed for Gregor, and all in all is something that controls him. In fact, that is shown with the Ego Gift bridle, which you can find in the floor theme line 2 in the Mirror Dungeon. Now, a bridle is the headgear for a horse used to control it, again reflecting that control of Herman over Gregor and how she might still be dictating over Gregor's actions. Even though this ego famously uses up every sin affinity twice, this is of course another reference to distortion. Carmen wants to feed and share every way of blooming and distorting, no matter the sin behind it, which in a way connects more with lust, as it is essentially about sharing a part of yourself. Distortion is that too in a way, is it not? You bloom into your deepest wish and share it with others, maybe through means of violence. Lastly, I want to say that I noticed when the corroded spread gets hurt, Gregor's eye looks happy in a way, well, more so in a sick way, with his head tilted as if almost observing. Now, if the eye represents the supervision Gregor has, then it could represent Herman being happy when Gregor gets hurt, or more so intrigued. But that might be a reach. It could also just be Gregor accepting / enjoying the pain over the thing that bounds him, as he himself said to not untangle the branches as it is better this way. But that's about all I could find about this ego. Still a bit vague, but still interesting. So next up is Lantern. This one is at some parts pretty straightforward, yet other things are kinda hard to connect. Lantern is related to the Fey Lantern abnormality, which is also related to Meat Lantern. Now, if you don't know, the fairies and lanterns are all about tricking and luring people, which makes the fact that Don has Meat Lantern, Sinclair and Yi-Sung also has a lantern, and Gregor have it make it more clear. I mean, Don kind of has a secret identity like Sinclair, and you can make a stretch to say that Yi-Sung's League of Nine pass was a secret at first. But then what would Gregor have? And what or who could he be luring? Luring something is hard to connect to the sinners in the first place, although it is a key part of the abnormality. But you can break luring down to its base level, which is tricking and not showing your true self. I mean, if you connect it more to the actual fight, where the tree hides its enormous body, it could again be in relation to Gregor's arm. In the ego itself, Gregor's arm turns into the actual tree, so again this symbolizes that Gregor is probably hiding his true form with his real arm. But in a way it's tricking and not showing its true self. The luring is actually more related to Sinclair, as his ego shows him dressed up as the fairy itself, the eyes being shown more, as Sinclair probably has more integrity. This is also shown in the passives, as Sinclair's passive is literally called Fairy Lure, and Gregor's is about nutrient absorption through the means of the tree. Funnily enough, according to the observation logs, its roots are wide-reaching and deep, which reminds me again of Herman's control symbolized through a way of reaching far with either branches, thorns, or gift wrapping has come across multiple times now in relation to Gregor's egos. But not only that, the fact that the real body is so old and wide could also be a reference to how the arm Gregor was given might be a part of something very old and is huge, that being the potential it has is also huge. But it's buried underground, meaning Gregor hasn't really unlocked using it correctly yet. But it being hidden underground could also reference hiding or running from problems. When Yi-Sung uses the evade skill on his lantern ID, he turns into the literal tree hiding the eyes. Gregor is someone who used to hide or run from his problems as well, as he literally ran from the war, yet funnily enough can't run from the control of his mother. In a way, he is still stuck like a tree, yet still tries to hide. Funnily enough, themes of ego gifts appear again, like with almost every Gregor ego, as in the Mirror Dungeon event. When you move on from the tree without resting as it tries to trick you, it attacks you. No such thing as free gifts, someone mumbles, which I think is nobody else except for Gregor. I'm sure Herman has repeated over and over to Gregor how his arm is a gift, yet only someone like him can know the consequences of receiving a gift like that. He doesn't believe in free gifts. He's unsatisfied with the arm obviously, as he's paid enough of a price for it. Now art-wise, Gregor wears a cape covering one of his eyes, is bound by twigs, and has a fairy on his shoulder. I think the fairy on his shoulder could reference Herman. It's like having an angel or devil on your shoulder telling you what to do. In this case, it's a trickster fairy. I mean, it's not like Herman has been a 100% honest person either. This is made more clear with the corroded version. I mean, just look at this. Gregor's vision is completely blocked off as he is put down, yet the fairy is standing on top of it all. I've said it before that blocked vision symbolizes that the sinner doesn't have a life or vision of their own, that they're blinded by something. In this case, I think that is Herman's control, and she seems to be happy to do so. But here comes the hard part of the ego, the voice lines.
How about I read you a tale?
Could be a reference to the fact that this abnormality is based off of the Shakespeare play, Midsummer's Night's Dream, in fact. Funnily enough, this play gets referenced again with the ego gift Midwinter Nightmare, but after reading the summary for Midsummer Night's Dream, I could only see how it connected to Sinclair with its somewhat queer themes, but I don't even want to get into that in this video. It seems to be a normal play about a love triangle and how it blurs the lines between reality and fiction with the fairies. The play even letting the viewer question if what they saw was a dream. So, if Gregor wants to tell you a tale, it might be about blurring the lines together between reality and fiction, but then again, what the H is that supposed to mean for Gregor in the first place? I mean, Gregor should question what he could do with his arm maybe, and since it's connected to light and the essence of humanity in the first place, it could reference how the people in the city need to question what it means to be human as well. But then there's the distorted line,
Too late. They've all been captivated.
Okay, now what is that supposed to mean? What makes it a bad thing if someone is captivated? Captivated by what? The fairy itself or something bigger? Then again, themes of losing one's identity appear in the play as well, but not in the same way as Gregor lost his. It's more so that desire and love play a role there. I mean, Herman might have had desires, she might have been captivated by her desires, but I feel like I can't do much with the information I have. The captivation might also be a reference to war culture, how some people can get lost in it as well, which could explain the it's too late mentality Gregor has here. And the tale in this context then could be a war tale. But then again, the lantern could be a reference to Gregor's role as a war hero. As Gregor in a way could soldiers to join the war, he was selling a war tale that wasn't real, and eventually it was too late. They were captivated by the culture and joined the war. In a way, Gregor was a tricking lantern by tricking soldiers by giving them a false image of war and G-Corp's experiment, although forced. As again, I think the fairy represents Herman, as she was behind this war hero image in the first place. I mean, the abnormality itself is a reference to a tree luring walking travelers for sustenance. In a way, the wing recruited soldiers to be fuel for a war too. The travelers then could be related to soldiers, as they were young lost people looking for a job in the city. He was selling a war tale that wasn't real, and eventually it was too late. They were captivated by the culture and joined the war. This can be backed up with how Gregor wants to hide in his version of the ego. He hides himself with a cloak, the Abno hides underground, and he hid the real true side of the war as well. Although, again, forced. Now lastly, affinity-wise, it's mostly gluttony with a bit of sloth. It makes sense in relation to the ego, as here Gregor is looking for nutrients and sustenance, and he does so through tricking, which makes it gluttonous in a way, but it's also represented as a tree, something unmoving, so sloth makes sense too. I mean, in the way that Gregor is listening to the fairy, aka Herman, he doesn't have his own ideas, so that unwillingness awareness of his own path in life could be slothful too. Although, I find gluttony harder to connect with Gregor, so I'm just gonna connect it to how gluttonous the war was by luring soldiers, or just how it's connected to how the abnormality works. That's all for Lantern Though I dread the day I have to connect this to Sinclair. Don't wanna miss that video when it comes out, why not subscribe? I mean, you've already watched a lot of this video, I'm sure you'll like my other stuff. Now let's move on. Anyone want a crunchy apple with a side of trauma and maggots? Let's talk about Legerdemain. Now I instantly had to look up what an apple could symbolize, and of course it's temptation, in reference to the Bible. Since hell, I already pulled religious symbolism out of my ass earlier. But the temptation can be further supported by the fact that it's a golden apple. I'm sure someone is more tempted to take a bite out of a golden apple than a normal apple. But the golden apples in itself symbolize immortality and divine power, yet also still conflict and temptation. But don't forget that goldenness of the apno is false, so it could symbolize false immortality. But I'll get into the connection with a certain apple in a second. Temptation is shown by the temptation to want to save it, actually. Remember how the abnormality used Yuri as a bait? In the Abno logs, Gregor himself mentions that he actually has an urge to want to kill this Abno instead. But all in all, this ego changes a lot, with Gregor saying it metamorphosized in a new hideous face. Even better, Gregor is writing the video for me, as he says he felt a kinship with the abnormality, how he sees it and himself both as pests. That feeling of being a pest also be referenced with the apple in its book counterpart. In the book, an apple gets thrown at Buck Gregor and gets stuck in his back. It's lodged in so hard actually that the apple starts to rot and stays with Gregor until he dies. The rotting of the apple symbolizes not only the decaying relationship between Gregor and his family, although also of course in the game, this rotting appears in the ego and abnormality itself. So much so that the abnormality has an ego gift you can find only in the Canto 1 themed floor of the mirror dungeon, contained maggots. Now the containment of these rotten maggots appear many times. Not only contained, but also something that needs to be hidden, as the normal version of the ego shows the golden apple version, yet the corroded version of the ego shows the rot. And of course the abnormality itself completely changes in the second phase, showing its original form was a lie, almost a bit like Fairy Lantern, as it doesn't like to represent its true form. But maggots and rot in general are something that morph together to turn into something else as well. Just take a look at your green recycling container. That apple surely doesn't look the same anymore thanks to the rot. Rotting is essentially a part of the cycle of life. It's a sort of change, a metamorphosis. To continue this, I'm gonna connect it with something else. You see, the abnormality is a reference to the apple of discord in Greek mythology. This apple was dropped by the goddess of strife and conflict, Eris, at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Now this created a dispute among Hera, Athena and Aphrodite that led to the Trojan War. By the way, here to say, if you thought the Trojan War was like real, it's not, it's mythology. I fucking thought it was real for like the longest time of my life for some reason, I don't know why. The Trojan War can be connected to the way the abnormality hides itself, like the troops did in the Horse to Infiltrate, but also references to infiltration, the Trojan War. What if Gregor really is the traitor by command of Herman, and he himself is the Trojan horse? He himself is the apple, the lure, as is his arm, if related to life, would surely interest Limbus' company. Herman would know that, so she used it to infiltrate. Gregor is traitor, Faust is traitor, everyone is a traitor. The apple of discourse, however, is mainly something that represents the core of a conflict that could lead to a bigger dispute, which fits with the smoke war too. Gregor knows all about conflicts, but it also fits with the rot as well. Both the conflict and a rot is something that can grow and spread. Other wings and corporation could get involved with the wing war. That was told to us in Canto 8 clearly, and the more are involved, the more are intrigued and want to join the war too. The way the apple uses someone as a lure could be a reference to bygone days, how the dead can be a motivator for revenge. You can essentially be lured to join the side of a war by an image of someone you used to know, and how you can be lured to join a war by how honorable it looks. You expect Little Dark Age to be played in the trenches, but when opened, it's filled with rot and death. Now the name Legerdemain means skillful use of one's hands when performing conjuring tricks. A bit vague, but skillful use of one's hand feels like a reference again to Gregor's arm. Although Gregor isn't really skillful with his arm yet, but the performance of tricks is interesting. Like I said, one might be lured to a war, maybe even by Gregor, but what makes it conjuring? What makes it magical? Just again the arm or the apple itself? But we still don't know jack shit about it, so I'm just gonna leave the name there to be honest. The voice lines are pretty straightforward luckily.
Listen, you think you could still stand up after that?
Could be in relation to the victim mentality Gregor has. He's one of the only ones standing after all of this, after the war. It is almost as if he were talking to a war comrade, which is further supported by the corroded line of
Together, we are in naught.
Meaning that together with his comrades, they aren't shit. They are in the war trenches. They all share the biological body alterations. He can somewhat understand what it is like for the other G-Corp soldiers. The soldiers' rot, in a way, could be G-Corp's experimentations, as the bug form slowly took over the soldiers as well, like a rot in a way. And the way it's biological makes the connection between rot make sense too. It's not mechanical, it doesn't rust, it rots. But if the rot still represents the relation between Gregor and his family, aka Herman, then in a way they are in rot together too. They both feel how their relationship relationship is unhealthy, although it bothers Gregor's more than Herman, of course. Now, affinity-wise, it's sloth and gluttony. Gluttony could be reflected in rotting family relations in a way, as it's a need for that will never be satiated. I think for Gregor, it's a need for a real motherly figure, but let's be real here, he's never going to get it. And for Sloth, of course, he won't change his ways due to his mother, since his ego is about the core of the conflict, either a family conflict or a whole-ass wing war. He himself was a war hero and recruited soldiers, and Herman's influence on the war was strengthened by Gregor's role, I bet. I mean, art-wise, his arm is the apple of conflict. You may be tempted by the golden apple, the potential benefits of a war like profit and conquest, but the consequences, the rot, spreads far and wide afterwards. Gregor, when corroded, is completely overtaken by that rot, whether that represents the bad relationship with his mother, or the negative consequences of a war, or both really. I hope this connection makes sense in a way. I'm sure there's way more that can be found with this ego and abnormalities that I missed. Yay! Finally a Lobotomy Corporation abnormality. Now I have more information to go off of. Anyways, according to Lobotomy Corporation logs, its origins are a mourner that existed to free employees that couldn't leave the company. However, with some employees not being granted death after resigning, the objective of laying them to rest was unachievable. All in all, the flavor texts are about the employees disappearing, mourning someone's death, and what happens when someone dies. This abnormality is very straightforward. It's all about death. The fact that this abno is wearing the coffin on its back obviously references survivor's guilt again. It's like the same as the Thorns crown. Gregor mourns his dead colleague soldiers and carries and mourns their memory with him. The abnormality is meant to represent no way to rest after death, and to connect that to a war, soldiers usually aren't buried properly, which in a way doesn't let them rest properly as well. Let me Google what a butterfly symbolizes. Okay, butterflies symbolize transformation, but of course they could also be a reference to how the dead visit us, as they can be a reincarnation of them. Now, the way the dead reappeared was through remembrance, of course, by making me think of bygone days again. Death can also be a way of transformation, as you transform from the living realm to the death realm. This is symbolized by the black and white colors of the abnormality, referencing the two planes of existence, probably. Funeral of the Dead Butterflies is also a reference to the Korean guraso, meaning overworked salaryman. It claims that many, like the overworked salaryman, flew away after failing to secure the job they wanted. This is supported by the ego gift of curriculum vitae you get from the Mirror Dungeon event. And of course, employment is also related by how the butterfly mourns employees' deaths. However, the flying away of the employees references suicide actually, which could connect to Gregor. I already said that Gregor's death in his book Counterpart is heavily implied to be suicide as well, and it fits even more that suicide happened because the salaryman was overworked. Gregor's book Counterpart got burnt out because of his work as well. Now, death could be metaphorical for Gregor too, as he never really lived his own life. The death of Gregor was early. Not only that, but death was all around him. It makes sense that this abnormality fits him. I don't even need to make many connections. Now, the voice lines reflect the mourning part of that abnormality.
What unfortunate, tragic children. I can do nothing but mourn for them.
Notice how he says children? This again could be a reference to young soldiers in a smoke war. Gregor couldn't really step out of his recruiting war world so easily, so all he could do for these young victims is to mourn for them. There's no use to struggle, reflected not only by his gloom skill of the ego, but also the corroded voice line.
That faith is just a hollow wish, isn't it? Let it go and sink gentle into the night.
Now, I wonder what the faith is though. Since it's about sinking into gloom, I think this is about the faith of going against Herman. There was basically no use. The war became his whole identity, it changed him, and the lust could represent the sharing of the pain between soldiers, and sloth, of course, the absence of trying to leave / resign from your position, which can be backed up by the fact that resigning in a war like this is basically impossible. Now, art-wise, there's not much to find other than Library of Runa and Lobotomy Corporation references, but all in all, I think this ego reflects Gregor's regrets, as he might feel to be responsible for the deaths of all these soldiers, again reflected in his voice line, that all he can do is mourn for them. But this ego is so straightforward and so easily connected to Gregor that this section ended up being kinda short. I guess theories and rambling make it easier to stretch a video to be this long, but if I missed anything, let me know, of course. The last one! Since this ego is in relation to the Arknights collab, it'll also be a bit short as well. Now, I've never played the Arknights, I don't feel like playing it for the video, I don't know if I will in the future. I heard from friends it's like Bloons, but with anime. But forgive me for not making perfect connections and this part being short since, you know, I haven't played it. But Gregor basically shares this ego with Mwynar. Now, in the world of Arknights, actual knights fight for the profit of mega corporations, and Mwynar is a retired veteran. Now, this obviously connects to Gregor as they both fought in a war meant for profit, and both are retired now. The name Unbrilliant Glory could be a reference to how Gregor, in a way, had some glory days, but they're certainly unbrilliant. Also, the knights from Arknights are referenced literally with Gregor's corrosion, as he turns into an Uma Musume with a knight outfit. Now, horses are, of course, a way of transportation for knights as well. According to the trivia, the horse is also supposed to be a reference to the Polish hussars, which were elite heavy cavalry soldiers active in Poland around 1503 1703 to 1702. Now Gregor takes this form because Munar is also supposed to be a reference to it. The ego background is like a swamp forest. For some reason, the reflection of the water is like a city. I asked someone in my server who played Arcanites for a reason why, and all they could say is that it could be a reference to Munar's canon night skin, but there's not really a clear connection. The city being reflected could just really be the city from Limbus, as it's meant to reflect the collab. Now the voice lines themselves are,
Don't fear the absence of brilliance. Rest assured, this sword won't be tarnished.
You know, all the talk about honor and glory reminds me of soldier talk, and the idea that the culture of war and soldiers is something that shouldn't be tarnished. Gregor himself uses the word glory and honor, but it's odd since Gregor usually would want the glory of war and this sword to be tarnished. He doesn't appreciate the culture at all. But that is reflected in his corroded lines, where Gregor says,
In this age, this dream, and this false glory, devoid of anything to get nostalgic over, even brilliant lights won't hurt their eyes!
Mentions of a false glory fit Gregor more. In combination with devoid of anything to get nostalgic over, reminds me of bygone days. It's almost like this ego represents the before and after of a soldier, first with hopes of honor and dreams, until afterwards a soldier might realize it's false glory. The hurting of eyes mentioned is a reference to Muinar's In Battle 1 voice line where he says, this won't hurt your eyes. Is it because his sword is so fucking bright? I don't know. There are more references to Muinar through the ego's mechanics in itself, where the need to charge conditions for it is similar to how Muinar's operates, as he's a Liberator guard, a unit that gains power from gradually not attacking, but also not when blocking either. Bro is made to stand on the sidelines, I guess. Guess he can do nothing but mourn. But standing on the sidelines and watching your comrades die could also be connected to Gregor. Anyways, this is reflected in the ego's inability to clash without using enough stacks of a mana scabbard. And honestly, there's more and more connections to Muinar, but not a whole lot to Gregor in itself that hasn't been said before. So lastly, sin affinities are wrath, sloth, and pride. Also sloth, of course, since that basically defines Gregor and his unwillingness to change. And pride, which is reflected in the first few voice lines. You can tell I'm not really a huge fan of this ego. I don't have to make stretches, but there's no cool connections either. It's just there. It's like, yeah, they're both war veterans and they're both retired and they used to be pawns of a big company / a wing, but it's not like their personalities are all that similar either. So you know what? I'll leave it like this. To summarize, Gregor has themes of regret in his past, where he might have felt like he lured young soldiers to their deaths, and because of his role as a propagandizing war hero and Herman's control, he couldn't do anything but watch. In fact, he started to grow a hatred of the culture around war so much that he ended up leaving and running away from his problems. But Herman's control goes so deep, so much so, that Gregor is used to it and maybe in fact needs control to function. He grew up in a cold environment without proper warmth and death all around him. This caused Gregor to cling to Herman and to change to fit Herman's vision and to never really make his own identity and decisions as he is shaped by the war that traumatized him. All that and the fact that there's a huge potential for his arm to blossom into way more and that Gregor might distort in the future. Wow, a way to summarize the longest video I've ever made. Thank you for watching this far though, I really do appreciate the support. If you want, why not subscribe or become a YouTube member? Starting at $1, you'll get access to a special channel and enroll in my Discord and get mentioned at the end of my videos like this. Thank you TenXcal and Ronald Media for the support. I'll probably make a video unrelated to Project Moon after this, but I'll see how this video performs to see if I'll make more ego analyses. Thank you, bye!